Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Hard Count podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about some must-draft wide receivers this year in fantasy football, some guys that could win you your leagues. Definitely consider drafting these guys at their current ADP. Before we get into it, though, please drop a like, subscribe. It helps me out a lot. And anyway, I would never want you to miss out on this regular content here at the Hard Count. So, yeah, without further ado, let's get right into the video. Our first guy, Robert Woods. One of my favorite picks this year in fantasy. Definitely at his current ADP, he's going in the 5th round. Please do yourself a favor. Take Robert Woods in your fantasy drafts. Last season, he had 140 targets, 8th highest of any receiver in the NFL, 1,134 receiving yards, 14th in the NFL. But he only had 3 total touchdowns, which is terrible. And that's what was holding back his fantasy production. And I think that's weighing down his ADP a little bit. And I'm not too concerned about the touchdowns because he has a lot of things that I love to see from receivers. Targets are always a great sign from any receiver, and one of the most important things to look at for a receiver when it comes to fantasy football, and that is there for Robert Woods. Again, 140 targets last season, 8th highest of any receiver. Robert Woods last season, he had a touchdown percentage of 1.3%. As we were just talking about, that terrible touchdown total really weighed down his fantasy production. But in the rest of the time he has been in LA as a Ram, he's averaged 5.1% touchdown percentage, almost 4 times what he put up last season. I have confidence in Robert Woods that his touchdown rate will significantly go up this season, be closer to that average 5.1%, which definitely will be huge. I expect more touchdowns for Robert Woods, closer to that 2018 mark of 7 touchdowns he put up, which is a very solid fantasy number. And one very great stat, thanks to Nick Ercolano for this one. Since the year 2000, there have been 220 receivers that have seen 140 targets or more in one season. Robert Woods is one of 5 out of the 225 of the 220 receivers that brought in 2 or fewer receiving touchdowns. And of those remaining 4 receivers out of the 5, the next season, all of them finished with at least 5 receiving touchdowns. It's most of the time we talk about guys being unsustainably good. Robert Woods, that's unsustainably bad in terms of touchdowns. So it's almost guaranteed that Robert Woods' touchdowns go up this year because that's just what history has shown. Those guys that get that many targets usually end up with more than 2 receiving touchdowns. So, next thing I want to talk about is the 12-man personnel thing. I talked about it in my Do Not Draft Receivers video. It's going to be shown right here. Click on that if you want to check it out. When I'm talking about Cooper Kupp. But if you're not sure what that is, it is essentially when you have 2 receivers on the outside and 2 tight ends on the field along with 2 running backs. And the Rams' offensive line was so bad last year that they ended up having to use this personnel much more towards the end of the season, and this really benefited Robert Woods. And if you want to watch the other video, I talked about how it impacted Cooper Kupp. But if we look at the numbers in the first 8 games of the season when the Rams weren't using this 12-man personnel nearly as much versus the final 7 where the Rams really made the switch and we saw that 12-man personnel come up a lot more in their games, Robert Woods averaged in those games with the 12-man personnel, he averaged 15.53 half PPR points versus 9.9 in the first half of the season. That's a huge gap. His receptions went from 4.75 to 7.43. His targets went from 7.5 to 11.43. His receiving yards went from 58.9 per week to 94.7 per week. As I said, this 12-man personnel is very helpful to Robert Woods' fantasy production. He works much better in this 12-man personnel, and he's the number 1 guy in this situation, but he's not being drafted above Cooper Kupp. And again, I said this in the other video. We could be seeing the Rams using this 12 personnel even more this year, just as much as they were using in that last half of last year. And we saw how well Robert Woods performed in those circumstances. So, yeah, I love Robert Woods this year. He has all the makings of a fantasy breakout player for me. Please pick him up in the 4th, 5th round of your drafts, and you will get a stud wide receiver, guy that could finish as a wide receiver 1, in my opinion. So definitely pick up Robert Woods in your fantasy drafts. Next, we have a relatively common thing you would like to see on these breakout lists, those sleeper wide receiver lists, and that's a guy named Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons. potential to be this year's Chris Godwin. You've probably heard it before, and I'm totally on board with this. I love Calvin Ridley in the fourth round, similar to Robert Woods. But I think we see a lot of similarities. I like the Chris Godwin comparison. The fact that they have both very pass-heavy offenses. Atlanta, Tampa Bay. Atlanta ran the most passing plays last year out of any team per game. And then you also got a number one guy, Mike Evans for Chris Godwin, Julio Jones for Calvin Ridley. Takes up a lot of those number one corners, the best pass coverage guy on each team. Stepping into that wide receiver 2 role, Calvin Ridley, definitely, and then also going into their third year. Reminds me a lot of that Chris Godwin season we saw last year, who, as he broke out, wide receiver 2, I believe, on the entire season. And again, for a guy that has the potential and is looking a lot like he could be Chris Godwin, his draft price is not really reflecting that. He's going in the 4th, 5th rounds of your draft, and you can get a guy with legit wide receiver 1 upside, and that's very exciting, especially in those rounds where you can get. That's where those make or break your team for the year. And so Calvin Ridley is a guy that I think will definitely make your team. Calvin Ridley, he played 14 games last year. If he didn't miss those 2 games, he would be on pace for wide receiver 14. And I think that I expect that to improve this year. The vacancies in targets and vacancies in touchdowns, red zone receptions is huge on this Falcons team. They lost Mohamed Sanu and Austin Hooper, 2 of their biggest pass catchers. And if we look at it, without Mohamed Sanu, just Mohamed Sanu on the field, and we take Ridley's production again, without Mohamed Sanu on the field, and we average it out and take a look at what it would be if it was a full season, he would be on pace for 130 plus targets, which would have been massive for Calvin Ridley. And that's not even taking away Austin Hooper. Yes, they added Hayden Hurst, Todd Gurley, who will get some pass catches, but there's 250 vacant targets to be spread around between all of them. And Calvin Ridley, you best believe, is going to get a lot of them. So that's very exciting for me for Calvin Ridley. Also, there's a big opportunity inside the red zone for Calvin Ridley, as the Falcons lost 56% of their targets inside of the 10-yard line. Many of those targets are going to go to Ridley. Again, the reason they lost all those is because of the loss of Mohamed Sanu, Austin Hooper, and a lot of those targets are going to go to Calvin Ridley. Some are going to go to Hayden Hurst, late round sleeper tight end for me. But I think Ridley, with that, is really going to be able to help maintain those touchdown numbers that he's had at an elite level throughout his entire career, even improve on those touchdown numbers from last year where he had 7, definitely double-digit touchdown upside, in my opinion, which many guys cannot say, especially in that 4th, 5th round range, but Calvin Ridley for sure can say that. And we all know Julio Jones not the best in the red zone, so where are those red zone receptions going? Calvin Ridley has had 17 touchdowns in his first 2 years, which is incredible. I think he can definitely keep it up, though, because of those vacancies in red zone targets and just targets overall. And so, yeah, I don't have too much to say about Calvin Ridley, but what is a breakout list without him? Definitely potential to be last year's Chris Godwin and league winner. Definitely draft Calvin Ridley in the 4th round, 5th round of your draft if he's available. So, yeah, love Calvin Ridley. Now, move on to my third guy. We've got Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals. And Tyler Boyd, must-draft receiver for me in 2020. Definitely pick him up considering how far he is falling. I think it's disrespectful how far Tyler Boyd is going down. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that when people look at the Bengals situation, Tyler Boyd's situation, you may think it's not the best for him considering how many guys are in that receiving room. You got T. Higgins, AJ Green, John Ross. But T. Higgins missed most of training camp with an injury. Rookie receivers, anyway, never really put up too much production oftentimes, especially a guy that's injured. I'm not a huge fan of T. Higgins this year in fantasy, but AJ Green, we talked about him in the Do Not Draft Receivers video. I don't think he's going to play this year. I think he's going to get injured again, but even if he is on the field, even if he doesn't get injured, I still can see a very good season from Tyler Boyd. Not to mention the fact that John Ross misses games like nobody's business, so I'm not expecting him to be on the field either. So right now, again, I was talking about with AJ Green, he can still have a good season with AJ Green on the field and T. Higgins on the field. Right now, Tyler Boyd is being drafted at his floor, in my opinion, because Boyd last season had 147 targets, 7th most in the NFL, and he's being drafted in the 8th round of your drafts. So I love Tyler Boyd this year. And here was what was very interesting to me. We all know Bengals drafted Joe Burrow as their quarterback of the future, and I love this pick. One of the best college quarterbacks we've seen ever. So what was very interesting, and I think this benefits Tyler Boyd a lot, is the fact that Joe Burrow loved to throw to the slot. He always has loved to throw the slot. And yes, this helps that it was Justin Jefferson last year, but Tyler Boyd is an elite slot receiver as well. We look at his stats last year. Joe Burrow in 2019 threw 49% of his passes to the slot, 52% of his yards came from the slot, and 60% of his touchdowns came from the slot. And if that isn't evidence, Joe Burrow loves the slot, targets it whenever he can, and is a better quarterback when he does target the slot. And Tyler Boyd is better in the slot as well. So it's like a dynamic combo we've got here. We've got a slot receiver, great slot receiver with a great slot quarterback, or a guy who loves to throw to the slot. Tyler Boyd last season ran 60% of his routes from the slot, which is a very high rate. And when AJ Green was on the field in 2018, Tyler Boyd ran 74%, even more of his snaps from the slot. So that's why I'm saying AJ Green being on the field doesn't really hurt him too much, because he's going to be able to play even more snaps in the slot where he was much more successful. His yards per game went up 20, and he scored every single one of his touchdowns. He scored 0 touchdowns in the games where he played more snaps on the outside than when he was in the slot. All of those touchdowns came from the games where he played the majority of the game in the slot. So I still think even if Green plays on the outside and is that dominant outside receiver that we've seen from AJ Green, Tyler Boyd can still command a lot of targets in that slot position. So I think when we talk about Tyler Boyd and the insane amount of targets he's getting, the high upside that he has this year, if AJ Green and company are off the field, along with Joe Burrow's tendency to throw to the slot, you would think we'd be talking about a guy that's going in the 5th, 6th round. But Boyd is going the 8th and 9th rounds of your draft. The value there is incredible for Tyler Boyd, one of my favorite later draft pickups. Definitely do yourself a favor here. Pick up Tyler Boyd in the later rounds, and will do you good in fantasy this year. So next we've got Marquise Brown of the Baltimore Ravens. My guy Marquise, I'm targeting in the 7th, 8th rounds of my fantasy, or 6th, 7th, 8th rounds my draft, depending on where he falls to. And I think this could be one of the big breakout seasons this year. Last season, Marquise Brown was on the field for 52% of the Ravens snaps. Not good at all, because when you look at guys like DeAndre Hopkins and stuff like that, they're playing 100% of the snaps, 99% of the snaps. 52%, safe to say, not very good. And as a result, the opportunity stats for Marquise Brown last season, not very convincing. But again, that's because he was off the field consistently with metal in his foot, and he was never really fully at 100% last year. Even John Harbaugh admitted this. But what really is drawing me to Marquise Brown is the efficiency numbers. Again, not the opportunity numbers, but the efficiency numbers. Hollywood ranked number 6 in quarterback rating when targeted, number 8 in fantasy points per route run. These efficiency numbers, very convincing to me. And because I expect those opportunity numbers, again, to go way up this year. He doesn't have metal in his foot. This offense is going to come out throwing 25, 30 times a game, which when they did last year, Marquise Brown was much more successful in fantasy. So this is definitely a good thing for Marquise Brown, the fact that I expect them to come out throwing a little bit more. Not to mention, they got rid of Willie Snead, and I believe this passing game solely will run through Hollywood Brown on the outside. Yes, they've got Mark Andrews who can get a lot of targets at the tight end position, but Hollywood Brown is the guy on the outside, and I expect Lamar Jackson to diversify things a little bit this year, try throwing outside down the field a little bit more. But yeah, thanks to Matt Harmon for this stat. Marquise Brown was above average. He was winning on almost every single route he ran last year, and he was consistently good in every, slant route, out route, deep route, post route. The only one he was not above average in was the comeback route. This goes along with the fact that out of every wide receiver in the NFL, Marquise Brown is given the 4th most cushion. People are scared of Marquise Brown, and he can take advantage of that underneath with those slant routes. And he did. We saw that multiple times last year. So when you look at Marquise Brown, it's clear he's the number 1 guy in Baltimore, accounted for over 40% in most of their receiving stats. 67% of their 40-plus yard receptions went to Marquise Brown. So he is the guy in Baltimore in an offense that was very successful last season, number 1 in points per game. And I expect them to come out throwing a lot more than they did last year. So also, I expect Hollywood's touchdown totals to increase, as I talked about this in Do Not Draft running backs. I'll put the video here if you want to watch in the description also as well. But I also expect his touchdown numbers to increase, considering the unrealistic amount of touchdowns in the air that Mark Ingram was getting last season in the red zone. So I expect some of those to go to Hollywood instead of Mark Ingram. So yeah, I am very excited for Marquise Brown this year. I think he's definitely a guy you want to consider picking up in that 7th round if you need a guy that has a lot of upside. So yeah, definitely draft Marquise Brown if he's available. Next, we've got one of the earlier round guys that I'm going to be targeting, and that is Allen Robinson, one of my favorite pickups in 2020. Probably will end up being my number 1 guy in a lot of drafts because he's one of my favorite guys in that 3rd round, where I like to take a wide receiver. I like going running back for the first couple rounds and then wide receiver in the 3rd, 4th rounds, because this year is a lot more top heavy on running backs. But Robinson had the third most targets of anyone in 2019. That is ridiculous. Only behind Julio and Michael Thomas, who were 2 of the first 3 guys going off the board at the wide receiver position. So that is ridiculous. And last year among wide receivers, let me just rattle this off real quick. This dude ranked 6th in receptions, 6th in completed air yards, 9th in red zone receptions, 13th in total touchdowns, 7th in snap share, 8th in target share, and 9th in route participation. And all this for the dude to go off the board as the wide receiver 14. You heard that right. Number 6 in receptions, number 6 in completed air yards. Allen Robinson commanded targets last year in that Bears offense. When I watched them on film, when I was watching Trubisky, I saw what seemed like them throwing to Allen Robinson on almost every play. It felt like that because he just always gets the ball. I mean, we know the quarterback competition in Chicago. It's not great. We don't have a great quarterback room there, but he has never had one in his entire career, but he gets targeted a lot. And I think that this quarterback competition in Chicago is going to be good for Allen Robinson. Between Nick Foles and Mitch Trubisky, I expect the better guy to come out there and play, and Allen Robinson is the dude. And especially now, David Montgomery, we know he's going to be out 2 to 4 weeks at this point. So that's a lot of, I'm guessing they're not going to be running the ball as much those weeks. They're going to be passing the ball a lot to Allen Robinson, so definitely a lot of upside in those first couple weeks. Robinson, again, has the ability to be one of the top receivers in fantasy this year. And as I was talking about, Robinson is going to be playing in the slot this year. This gives me confidence that he can keep his production numbers up. We've seen guys like Cooper Kupp last year, because they were in the slot, not necessarily the best talents, but again, there's a trend among receivers in the slot that when they're in the slot, they perform very well in fantasy. So you naturally put up more numbers. And I think all that is holding Robinson back is the quarterback play, and I think that will improve this season again. So Robinson commands targets everywhere on the field, and that is a skill, something Robinson does very, very well. He is going to get a lot of targets this year. I expect him to maintain his touchdown total. So do yourself a favor, draft Robinson in the 3rd, 4th round of your fantasy drafts, and you have a guy that could potentially be a league winner for you. All right, that was my last guy that I have here. And then here are some other guys right now. I'm listing them up on the screen. Here's some other guys that I like a lot at their current average draft positions. So let me know if you want me to make a video on these guys as well and explain why I really like them, but I didn't want to make the video too long for you guys, so I wanted to keep it under 20 minutes. So yeah, thanks so much for listening. These are my must-draft wide receivers for 2020. They could help you win your league. Yep. Thank you guys so much for listening. Peace.